She heard them celebrating his death, inside his own hall, with his own wine. Who gave the order? The Stormhold pack, ancient, brutal, built on blood oaths and silver blades. His general took the throne, his queen lit the candles. And a girl who cleaned floors heard everything. She could have run, she had mapped every way out. Instead, she stood in the dark corridor, alone, and waited for a king who wasn't supposed to come home. When he finally looked at her, really looked, she didn't flinch. She had already spent her fear. Wolves across the ridge, drones cutting through winter sky, silver weapons in foreign crates, burning torches on a black river, a dead man's coin. An alliance built on 20 years of fury. Armies riding at dawn. Everyone had underestimated the woman carrying the map. Stay silent, she saved a king. Now he has to decide what to do about that. Let me ask you something. When was the last time a man you trusted looked you in the eye and lied to your face? Not a small lie. Not the kind you forgive over a drink. The kind that costs you everything. The kind that leaves you standing in your own house, wondering whose house it really is. You probably didn't see it coming. Neither did Ragnar. The snow that night didn't fall the way it falls in stories. It fell sideways. Mean. The kind of snow that bites through wool and reminds a man he's mortal. Ragnar Wintermane rode alone through the high pass north of his keep, his warhorse picking through drifts that came up to the animal's knees. He hadn't slept in 2 days, he hadn't shaved in 5, and he wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be 300 miles north, at the front, sitting in a war tent with generals and maps and the slow grinding politics of a campaign that was supposed to last another 5 days. Minimum, that's what he'd told his queen. That's what he'd told his court. That's what he'd written in the dispatch he sent ahead of his own absence. Except the campaign ended in 3 hours. Because the barbarian chieftain Ragnar had ridden north to negotiate with was murdered in his own tent by his own son before Ragnar even unstrapped his sword. A coup. Quick, bloody, stupid. The son wanted peace and didn't want to wait for it. Ragnar had stood in that tent looking at the dead chieftain on the furs and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not satisfaction, not relief, just tired. Tired of watching men kill their fathers for thrones not worth the killing. So he left. He left his battalion to handle the treaty. He left the negotiating to men who liked tables more than horses. And he rode south alone because for once in 30 years of ruling the Stormhold pack he wanted to be a man instead of a king. He wanted to walk into his own keep through the servants' gate. He wanted to surprise his wife. He wanted to give her the silver pendant he'd pulled from the barbarian's treasure stash, the one shaped like a winter rose, the kind of thing she used to love before things between them turned into long silences and longer arguments. He wanted more than anything one quiet night. That's what he was thinking when his horse came over the last ridge and Stormhold Keep rose against the grey sky like a tomb, dark every window. Dark now, you have to understand. Stormhold Keep was never dark. Not at twilight, not in winter. Queen Sigrid kept fires burning in every room because she hated the cold and hated the dark even more. There were always torches in the courtyard. Always lanterns in the windows of the upper hall. Always something, always. Ragnar's hand went to his sword without him telling it to. 30 years of war teaches a body to react before the mind catches up. He guided his horse east, away from the main gate, and tied him in the stand of pines that grew against the curtain wall. He unstrapped his cloak and shook off the snow. He pulled the leather pouch with the silver pendant from his saddlebag and tucked it inside his jacket against his chest, and then he walked, quiet as he could in heavy boots, to the servant's door. The key was his alone, carved bone blackened with age. Only one other person had ever held a copy, and that person was dead. He turned the lock. The door opened without a sound. The hinges had been oiled within the last week. He noticed that. Then he wondered why he noticed that, and then he wondered why he was wondering at all. He stepped into the corridor and pulled the door shut behind him. He stood for a moment with his back to it and let his eyes adjust. The stone walls of the servants' passage were the kind of cold that had been built up over centuries, the kind that lives in the bones of a building and only lets go in high summer. His breath came out in white plumes. He could see his breath inside his own house. The kitchen was empty. The great hearth was cold, not banked for the night. Cold, the kind of cold a stone takes hours to lose. There were no pots on the fire, no bread on the boards. No old Margaret muttering over the stew the way she'd muttered over stews for the past 20 years. She slept in the room behind the pantry, and the door to that room was open, and the bed inside was made, and the blankets were folded at the foot of it the way you fold blankets when nobody is coming back. He stood in the doorway looking at that bed for a long moment. He had known Margaret since he was 30. She had baked the bread at his coronation. She had pressed a piece of it into his hand and told him to eat it standing up because a king who eats sitting down forgets the kitchen. He had eaten it standing up. He had eaten it standing up at every meal for a month after. She had been the one who told him, the year his son was born, that Sigrid wasn't sleeping and that maybe a king should notice. The folded blankets meant Margaret was not asleep upstairs. The folded blankets meant Margaret had been told to leave. He moved through the corridor with his sword half drawn. 6 inches of steel, enough to kill a man if he came around the corner, not enough to commit. He'd learned that in the Blackwood ambush 5 years back. A king who draws full steel in his own house is a king who doesn't trust his house. He had been telling himself for a long time that he trusted his house. He was discovering in the cold of his own kitchen that the telling had been the trusting. There had been nothing under it. He turned the corner toward the main stair, and then the shape stepped out of the shadow under the carved arch, and his sword came up the rest of the way without him deciding it would. The shape gasped, stumbled back into the thin grey bar of moonlight from the high window. Not a guard, not a soldier, a girl, Young's. Small dark hair in a braid that had come half undone, a plain grey servant's dress, eyes too big for her face, hands clenched around a bundle of cleaning rags like the rags would save her Bryn. He knew her name because a king should know the names of the people in his own household, and he had been making an effort lately to try. She'd come on 4 months back, worked the upper halls, quiet girl, never spoke unless spoken to. The kind of Omega who'd been taught by life that being noticed was the same as being hurt. He lowered the sword, not all the way, just enough, Bryn. His voice came out low. A growl built for a battlefield, hushed for a hallway. Where is everyone? Why are the fires out? She didn't answer. Her eyes went up, toward the top of the stair, toward the king's tower, then back to him, and he saw in that flicker something he had not expected to see in his own house. Not surprise, not even fear of him. Fear of dying. She crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps and grabbed the leather strap across his chest and pulled him into the alcove under the staircase with a strength he wouldn't have credited her with. He went because the alternative was making noise. His back hit cold stone. Her face was inches from his, pale as a candle. She lifted one shaking finger and pressed it to her lips. Stay silent. The whisper barely made it out of her throat. My king, she breathed, the words shaped more by air than voice. You're at the front, campaign ended. Then they don't know. Who doesn't know what? She looked up again. Toward the tower, toward the warm gold light he could now see, faintly, spilling under a door at the top of the stair, the only warm light in the entire fortress. Then she looked back at him, and the next words came out so quiet. He had to read them off her mouth as much as hear them. They're celebrating your death. Something in him went very still. It wasn't shock. Shock comes from surprise, and he hadn't been surprised by anything in a long time. It was the other thing. The thing a warrior feels when the world rearranges itself in one sentence and he understands, suddenly and completely, that he is in a fight he hasn't started yet. He looked down at her. He was a head and a half taller. Braid had come most of the way undone, and there was a smudge of soot on the inside of her wrist, where she'd touched a cold lamp she didn't have permission to relight. She was 24 years old. He had heard one of the senior stewards say it once, passing him in a corridor. He had filed it the way he filed any small fact about the people who lived under his roof, and he had never thought about it again. He was thinking about it now. He was thinking about how he had been a king of this country before this girl had taken her first breath. He was thinking about how she had stood in this corridor tonight by herself, knowing what was waiting at the top of the stair, and she had not run. He was thinking about a great many things at once, and none of them helped him decide what to do next. How sure are you? He breathed. I have served them tea. Tonight, in there. How many? 2. In the corridor outside. She hesitated. He saw her counting in her head. Not guessing, counting, the way a person counts who has memorized the watch rotation of an entire building. 6 armed, 2 with crossbows. He breathed out slowly through his nose. He did not look up the stair yet. He wanted to. The wanting was a hot thing in the back of his throat. He had not felt rage like that in 20 years, and he was old enough now to know that rage was the worst counsel a man ever takes. Rage runs upstairs, rage kicks open doors. Rage dies on a rug it knew the smell of. He stayed where he was. Why are you down here? He said. Because Margaret told me to go. Where did Margaret go? They sent her to her sister in the lower town. 3 days ago, they sent all the older staff away. They kept only the new ones. The ones loyal to him. And me, why you? Because they didn't think I mattered. He absorbed that, and you stayed. Yes, why? She looked at him. The bar of moonlight fell across her jaw, across the smudge on her wrist, across the dark of her eyes. She did not look afraid anymore. She had spent the fear already. She had spent it climbing down the stair to meet him in the dark. Because I owed you, she said. For what? Later, he nodded once. The later was a promise between them. He would keep it. He would make her keep it too. He let his hand come off the sword. He pressed his palm flat against the cold stone of the alcove wall to steady himself, because the floor of his own house had begun to feel like the deck of a ship that was no longer his to command. He looked at last up the stair. The slice of gold light under the chamber door at the top of it cut across the dark like a knife somebody had set down and forgotten to pick up. He was going to go up that stair. He was not going to kick the door. He was going to listen. He signaled her to stay. He bent and unlaced his boots one at a time and set them against the stone wall. The cold went straight through his wool socks into the soles of his feet, and he did not care. In socks he was silent. In socks he could kill a man before the man knew he was in the room. He went up the stair the way a hunter goes up a stair outside edge, where the wood is held, no creak, no breath. He passed the second landing. He passed the small alcove where a tapestry of his coronation hung in the dark. He had been 25 in that tapestry. He had stood with one hand on the sword of his father and one hand on the head of a young hound that had died of old age the year his son turned 12. He did not look at the tapestry now. He could feel it watching him as he went past. He reached the door at the top of the king's tower, the door to his own chamber. It was open. Not all the way. Just enough to let a slice of firelight cut across the stone floor of the corridor like a knife laid down on a table. He flattened himself against the wall beside the door. He breathed through his nose. He listened. And he heard them. A woman's laugh first, low, throaty, pleased with itself. He knew that laugh. He had heard it the night he proposed. He had heard it the night his son was born. He had heard it across 30 years of dinners and councils and quiet evenings in front of the fire. It was the laugh of Sigrid, his queen, and it had never sounded like this before. It had never sounded glad. Are you certain about the timeline, Drogon? If the battalion returns and reports that he left early, questions will arise. Drogon Ragnar's hand closed on the hilt of his sword so hard his knuckles cracked. The cracking sounded enormous to him. It must have sounded like nothing to the people inside, because the man who answered her was Drogon Blackiron, his general, his right hand. The boy he had pulled out of a dying border garrison 15 years ago and trained with his own sword. The man whose father he had buried. The man who had stood at the foot of his bed when his son was born and sworn an oath in blood to protect that son with his life. Relax, my queen, and the word my landed on Ragnar like a hammer. The messenger I sent ahead confirmed the story. As far as the battalion knows, their king fell in glorious battle against the Northmen, an ambush. Very tragic, very heroic. A glass clinked, a bottle, wine poured 30-year Thornberry. The vintage Ragnar kept locked in the cellar for the night his son's son would be born. And the actual Ragnar, Sigrid asked the way a woman asks about the weather, buried in a northern snowdrift, with a barbarian's axe in his spine. The barbarians are signing confessions as we speak. Well, the ones I paid are Ragnar's lungs forgot what to do. You think when you imagine a moment like this, that it will feel loud, that there will be drums in your chest and red in your vision, that you will want to kick down the door and put your sword through both of them, before the next breath leaves their mouths. He had imagined a lot of things across 30 years. He had never imagined this. It didn't feel loud. It felt like standing in a room and watching the floor drop out from under it. Very slow, very quiet. The way a man falls in a dream before he remembers he's allowed to wake up. How long have you been planning this? There was something in her voice he had to name before he could keep listening. Admiration. She was admiring him. 18 months. 18 months. His mind went back. He couldn't help it. 18 months ago. The autumn the leaves came down red. The autumn Sigrid had walked into the war room for the first time in a decade and asked about troop movements and supply lines and how a battalion was rotated through a winter front. He had been touched. He had thought at last, after years of distance, she was trying to share his world. She had been measuring his throat for a knife. I remember the day you came to me in the training yard. Drogon's voice was soft now, the soft of a man speaking to a lover. You had just watched me defeat 3 warriors in succession. You said all that strength was wasted on a king, who only knew how to take orders from himself. She laughed again. That same low laugh. The hardest part was getting the loyal ones out of the way, the old guard, the ones who would have died for him, reassigns, distant postings, missions that kept them away. Halric was the hardest. The name went through Ragnar like a blade. Halric Stormwatchheat, childhood friend, first lieutenant, the boy who had taught Ragnar to fish a frozen stream when they were 9, the man who had stood at his shoulder for every major battle Ragnar had ever fought. Halric had died on a routine patrol 4 months back, fell from his horse, broke his neck. Tragic accident. The funeral had been small because Halric had asked for it small. Ragnar had cried in private for the first time in 20 years. Halric suspected. Drogon said it the way another man might say it had rained on a Tuesday. He started asking questions, watching the wrong people, so he had an accident, fell from his horse, broke his neck. A pause. He didn't fall, of course. I broke it for him. It was the casualness that did it. Ragnar had killed men, a lot of men. He had cut down enemies in trenches and on walls and in the rotten snow of a dozen winter campaigns. He had stood over dead bodies that he had made dead and felt every weight a man is supposed to feel for that work. He had never spoken of a dead friend the way Drogon had just spoken of Halric. He had never spoken of any dead man that way. Some men kill because they have to. Some men kill because they want to. And the second kind, Ragnar understood, in the stone corridor outside his own bedroom, is the only kind a king should ever fear. What about the Omega? Sigrid's voice sharpened the way a knife sharpens on a stone. That mousy little maid, Brynn, she cleans everywhere she might have seen. A pause inside the room, a long one. The sound of wine being sipped. I'll handle her tomorrow. An accident. Maybe she falls from the tower stair. Maybe a fire in the servants' quarters. These things happen, make it clean. She won't be the only one. I've already replaced most of the household with people loyal to me. The few remaining will either swear or follow her example. Glasses touched. Crystal, to us. Sigrid's voice was warm now. The warmth of a woman who has waited a long time for a meal, to the future, to freedom from the old king and the old ways. They laughed together, his wife and his general, in his bed, laughing at his death and toasting the murder of a girl whose only crime was carrying a tray of tea past the wrong door. Ragnar's hand was still on his sword. He felt his arm tense. He felt his weight shift toward the door. One kick, one swing. He could put both of them on the floor before the wine in those glasses hit the rug. It would feel good. It would feel right. It would also be the last thing he ever did. A cold, small hand closed around his wrist. He almost killed her. He almost turned and drove the point of his sword through whoever had touched him, because in that second every man he loved had become a man who could kill him, and there were no exceptions left in the world. He stopped because the hand was the size of a child's. He stopped because the grip was not the grip of an enemy. It was the grip of someone holding a falling friend, Brynn. She had come up the stair behind him, silent. He hadn't heard a single step. She put a finger to her lips and held up something small in her other hand. A piece of polished glass, no bigger than a coin. She angled it past the doorframe and tilted it so he could see what it showed. 6 men. In the corridor beyond his chamber, armed. Waiting. 2 with crossbows. The doorway was a kill box. If he went through that door, he would put a sword in Drogon and Sigrid, and then 6 bolts would put him on the rug beside them. They would write the story however they wanted after that. A faithful general defending his queen from a deranged stranger. A grief-stricken widow rescued from an impostor. The other packs would believe what they were told because there would be no one left to tell them anything different. He looked one more time at the slice of gold light under the door. He listened one more time to the laugh of the woman who had shared his bed for 30 years. He memorized it. The sound, the pitch, the particular way she breathed at the end of it. He was going to need it later. For fuel. Then he stepped back from the door, and he let the girl lead him down the stair. They went the way she'd come up. The servants' way. The way the people who clean the floors know better than the people who walk on them. She moved in front of him, sock-footed and steady, and he followed a king led by a maid down a back stair in his own house. He thought, halfway down, that this was the first time in 30 years he had followed anyone anywhere. They passed through the kitchen, past the cold hearth, past the boards where Margaret should have been kneading dough. Brynn turned into the dry storage room behind the kitchen, the one piled with sacks of grain and braids of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and she went straight to the back wall and put her shoulder against a tall oak shelf and pushed. The shelf swung. It swung on hidden hinges he had not put there. He stood and watched it swing, and he understood that he did not know his own house. Through here, her breath was a thread. He went through. The shelf closed behind them and the dark closed with it. There's a ladder. Her voice was close enough that he felt the breath of it on his jaw. It goes to the old wine cellar. The one before the keep was expanded. I sealed that cellar 30 years ago. You sealed the main entrance. There were no other entrances. A pause. The dark made her voice smaller, or maybe more honest. Your grandfather was a paranoid man, my king. There are 3 ways in. I found the drawings in the archive. You read building drawings. I read everything. She did not say it with pride. She did not say it with apology. It was the flat statement of a person who had been alone with paper for a long time. When you're invisible, people don't notice. You have time. He felt for the ladder. His hand closed on cold iron. He went down first because as no matter what was happening in his house, he was still the man who went first. The air at the bottom of the ladder tasted like old stone and dust and the ghost of wine. The cellar was a long, low room. He could feel the curve of the vaulted ceiling without seeing it. He could feel more than that, the age of the place. This was the bones of the keep his grandfather built. This was older than the renovation he had done with his own hands when he was 28, and certain the world could be remade if a man put enough stones on top of each other. He had been wrong about a lot of things at 28. There's a drainage tunnel, Bryn's whisper carried in the vault. It exits by the river, about a mile. How do you know? I came down here last month. I wanted to know all the ways out. In case of what? A pause again. Longer this time. In case of needing to run, he stood in the dark and let that sit. A young Omega, 4 months in his house, had been mapping escape routes in the foundations of his keep, alone by lantern, between her shifts of mopping floors. Not for him, for herself. Because she had known, in the way the small and watched always know, that something was wrong in the high tower long before the man on the throne ever guessed. He felt then, the first thing he had felt all night that was not the cold sliding edge of betrayal. It was shame, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that lives under everything else for the rest of a man's life. They moved through the cellar, their boots crunched over broken pottery and the brittle leaves of decades. Somewhere above them, very faint, he heard the first sounds of search. A boot on stone, a voice barking an order. Then another voice answering. Drogon would have a head count by now. Drogon would know 1 boot was missing from the servant's door. He'll seal the obvious exits first. Then we have an hour, less. They reached the wall at the far end of the cellar. She knelt and ran her hands along the base of the stone until she found what she was looking for. An iron grate, half rusted shut. Beyond it, a low square tunnel and the smell of cold water and rotting reeds. This will make noise. Then we make it once. He set his shoulder against the grate and pushed. The metal screamed. Above them, somewhere in the house, a shout went up. They went on hands and knees through ice water that bit through the wool of his trousers like teeth. The tunnel was narrower than a man's shoulders. He scraped both. He felt skin tear and didn't care. Behind them, the search reached the cellar. Behind them, boots crashed against the broken grate. Behind them, a voice he had trained. A voice he had taught to give commands, called his name through stone. Your Majesty? Drogon's voice. Soft, like a friend at a sickbed. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood. He did not answer. He crawled. Ahead of him, Bryn turned a corner. He followed. The water got deeper. The tunnel bent. He saw finally a circle of grey light at the end, the color of a winter sky just before the sun gives up. They came out onto a slope of frozen mud at the edge of the river. The wind hit him like a hand across the face. The river was 20 feet wide here and moving fast. The kind of fast that swallows men. The kind of fast that scrubs scent off a fugitive better than any dog. From the keep behind them came a sound that turned his blood to slush hounds, not wild ones. The pack, his pack, the ones he had bred, the ones he had named. Bryn was already moving. She didn't look back to see if he was coming. She didn't need to. He went after her. They ran through brush and ice until the bank dropped away and the water rose up to meet them like a mouth. He grabbed her wrist before she could plunge. If we do this, we don't come back. Not as ourselves. She looked at him. She was 24 years old and she was barefoot in the snow, and her braid had come all the way undone and her face was the color of the moon and she was not afraid. Tired, hurt, pale enough to faint, but not afraid. The fear in her had ended in the corridor under the staircase. She had spent it all. There was nothing left to be afraid of now, my king. The title came out without grandeur. The way a person speaks a name they have made peace with. I lost myself a long time ago. He squeezed her wrist once. the way men squeezed the wrist of a man they go to war with. Then he jumped and he pulled her after him, and the river took them both. The cold was not cold. The cold was a wall a man hits with his whole body at once. The breath went out of him before he understood that his lungs were not his anymore. He held her hand. He didn't know why. He knew if he let her go she would die. He knew if she let him go he would deserve it. So he held. The current slammed them downstream. A rock came up out of the dark and he twisted and took it on his shoulder so it wouldn't take her in the ribs. The shoulder popped. He felt the joint shift in a way joints aren't meant to shift. He kept hold of her hand. He set his jaw against the white inside his head. They went under. They came up, they went under again. The keep was a black shape against a black sky shrinking behind them. He saw for 1 second between waves, torches on the far bank. 6, then 10, then a line of them. Drogon was already out. Drogon was already hunting. A fallen tree came up across the current like a hand reaching for them. He pulled her against his chest and curled his body around her, and they went into the branches together. Wood tore his cheek open. He felt it without feeling it. He came out the other side and the current widened and slowed, and his boots, miraculously, found stone. He dragged them both onto a rock shelf under an overhang. He set her down. She was shaking so hard her teeth made a sound like coins on a table. He was shaking too. He had not noticed. He got a fire going under the overhang because his hands knew how to get a fire going, even when his mind was somewhere else. 3 strikes. 4. On the 5th the sparks caught the dry moss he scraped from the cracks in the stone. The flame was small. It would have to do. He stripped his outer layer of soaked wool and wrung it, and laid it on a flat rock near the flame. He turned away while she did the same. Survival is not modesty. Survival is staying alive long enough to be embarrassed later. When she was done, she crawled in close to the little fire, and so did he, and they sat shoulder to shoulder under a foot of black rock, with a winter river at their feet, and the sound of dogs somewhere behind them on the other bank. For a long minute neither of them said anything. Then he reached into his jacket, the inside pocket, the waterproof one. The pendant was still there, the silver winter rose. He had carried it for 200 miles to give to a woman who had spent 18 months planning his murder. He turned it over once in his fingers. He thought about throwing it in the river. He didn't. He tucked it back inside his coat. Some weights a man wants to keep for a while, just so he remembers what they cost. Bryn, my king, stop that. We're past that, she didn't answer. He looked at her. The fire put gold on the side of her face. Her braid was gone for good. Her hair stuck wet to her cheek. There was a scrape across her jaw where a branch had caught her. She was watching the fire the way a person watches a thing they have been watching alone for a long time, in the corridor. Under the stair, you knew. You knew before I did, 3 weeks, and you stayed. A small movement of her shoulder. Not a shrug. Something quieter. Where would I go? You could have run. I had nowhere to run to. So why warn me? She didn't answer right away. She reached up and touched, without thinking about it, a thin chain that lay against her collarbone under the wet collar of her dress. A small thing. He hadn't seen it. It was the kind of small thing a person doesn't show. 6 months ago, there was a man in the market square, a merchant. He was beating a girl. She had dropped a basket of apples. He was beating her for the apples, he remembered. Vaguely, he had been riding through on patrol. He had not stopped to think. He had simply gotten down off his horse and broken the man's arm in 2 places and put the girl in the kitchens at the keep and told the steward to make sure she had a place. He had ridden on. He had not thought about it again. That girl was my cousin, the only family I had left in the world. You didn't know. You didn't ask her name. You just stopped. She looked at him then. The fire moved in her eyes. You gave me back the only person I had. 3 weeks ago I heard them in the tower. I knew what they were planning. I had to choose. I am Omega. I have no pack and no protection and no place. I should have run. I made a list of every reason I should have run. But I owed you for her. So tonight I stood in your hallway and put my finger to my lips and I gave it back. She turned back to the fire. That's the whole reason. There isn't more. He sat with that for a while. The fire ate the dry moss and asked for more, and he fed it a curl of bark. Across the river the dogs had stopped. The torches were moving. Drogon was thinking, on the other bank, the way Drogon had been trained to think, the way Ragnar had taught him to think. There was no comfort in that. There was the opposite, your father. Tell me his name. Garin Ashthorn. He had not expected that. He went very still. Then he said, Garin Ashthorn was a strategist out of the Eastern Pax. He died in a coup when his prince was murdered at the supper table by his own brother. I was 28. We were going to meet that spring to talk about an alliance. I was 12 when they killed him. What happened to you? What happens to a 12-year-old Omega, whose father has been declared traitor? He didn't ask her to finish. He had been a king long enough to know. He shifted then, because his shoulder was screaming and because something had occurred to him, and he wanted to look at her when he said it. Bryn, empty your pockets. She blinked at him. Please? She did. There was nothing much. A pebble, a length of waxed string, a folded square of cloth she'd used for some forgotten purpose, and last, weighing more than its size, a small bronze disc the shape of a wolf's head with the eye stamped through. He took it. He held it on his palm beside the fire. He had not seen one of those in 20 years. It was a gift. From who? She hesitated. Then she said, a captain. 4 months ago. The day I was hired. He stopped me in the lower hall and put it in my hand and told me not to lose it. He said if I ever needed anything inside the keep I was to show it. To no one but you. What was his name? Halric Stormwatch. The wind under the overhang shifted. The fire bent and came back up. Ragnar Wintermane sat on a wet rock at the edge of a black river, in the dead middle of a winter he had not been supposed to live through, and he looked down at the medallion of his dead friend in the hand of a girl he had barely noticed in his own house, and he understood finally why she had been standing in his hallway tonight. Halric had known. Halric had known something was coming, and Halric had put one last piece on the board before they killed him. He had found a quiet Omega with a strategist blood in her veins and a debt to the king she didn't owe out loud, and he had put her inside the walls, and he had given her a bronze coin, and he had said to no one but him, and then he had let himself be murdered, because a man who suspects the people watching him stops being a man who can warn anyone. Halric had bought silence with his own neck. Halric had spent his last weeks making sure that if the worst came, there would be one person in the keep who would not run, who would know where the back doors were, who would have a reason to put her finger to her lips and say stay silent in the right corridor at the right second. Ragnar closed his fingers around the medallion. He didn't say anything for a long time. He couldn't. There are griefs a man saves for later because if he opens them now they will drown him. He put this one in the place he was building inside himself tonight, and he closed the door on it, and he turned the key in the lock, and he tried not to think about how many doors that room was going to need before this was over. Across the river the torches were thinning. He looked east, into the dark, where the mountains were. They moved at the second watch. The fire had gone to ash and the river had not gone quiet, and Ragnar made the call that the river was a worse risk than the woods. Dogs lose a man in water. Dogs find a man in trees only if a man is stupid. He was a lot of things tonight. Stupid was not one of them. The medallion was inside his coat now. He had asked her if she wanted to keep it. She had said no. She had said it was always meant for him. He had not known how to answer, so he hadn't. They climbed the bank using roots for handholds. His shoulder still wasn't right. Every pull sent a hot wire down his back to his hip. He told it to wait. He had spent 30 years telling parts of his body to wait. Some of them lately were starting to argue. They reached the ridge above the river and turned east. East was wrong, east was uphill. East was the mountains where the wolves got bigger and the air got thinner and the maps got worse. East was also where Theron Greymore sat in a hall built into the side of a mountain like a knife driven into a loaf of bread. That was the point. Drogon would search south. Drogon would put riders on the southern road before dawn because the southern road was where every reasonable man in Ragnar's position would go. There were old allies down south. There were minor lords who still owed Ragnar favors. There were warm fires and quiet rooms and the chance, if a man played it carefully, to rebuild. Drogon had been trained by Ragnar to think like Ragnar, which meant the only move left was a move Ragnar would never make. He told her this as they walked. She listened. She did not interrupt. She had a way of listening that he was beginning to understand was its own form of speaking. After a while, she said only one thing. 20 years is a long time to hate a man. Yes, he'll have hated you well. He will have. And we're walking toward him. We are. She considered that for a few steps in the snow. Then she said, good. He looked over at her. She didn't look back. Her breath came out in small white plumes, and she watched the ground for tracks, and the next thing she said was about a rabbit warren they were passing. He filed the word away. Good. He would think about it later. He had a lot of things to think about later. They walked the rest of that night and most of the next day. They slept in a hollow under a fallen pine that had taken half a hillside down with it. He let her sleep first. He sat with his back to the trunk and his sword across his knees, and he watched the grey seam of dawn pull itself across the trees like a tired curtain. Halric, he thought. You knew, and you didn't write to me, and you didn't ride south to tell me, and you didn't break protocol and put yourself at a war council and make me listen. You found a girl. You gave her a coin. You said no one but him. And then you got on the horse you knew you weren't coming back from. You were always smarter than me. You should have been the king. He hadn't said it out loud. He was glad. Some things, if you say them in the open, don't ever come back. Across the hollow the girl slept curled like a fox kit with one arm under her cheek, and he understood with a slow, flat clarity that the only person on this continent who could still vouch for who he was and who he had been was the cousin of a stranger in a market square 6 months ago. The mountains were 5 days east. They made it in 3. They moved on broken sleep and dry meat, and snow melted in his cupped hands. They moved on his bad shoulder and her torn boots. They moved on the simple animal fact that stopping meant dying. The first day they cut sign of a patrol and pulled back into a creek bed for an hour, and ate nothing and said nothing, and watched 4 armored men in Stormhold colors ride past on the other ridge without a single one of them looking down. His own colors. His own crest. He had stitched that crest himself the year he was crowned, because a king should know how a thing is made before he asks other people to die in it. It hung from the back of a man he did not know, on a horse he had bought with his own treasury. Hunting him through his own country, Bryn put her hand on his wrist without looking at him. He understood after a second that he had reached for his sword without meaning to. He let his hand fall away. Not yet. No, we get to keep that. Yes. She did not move her hand for another moment. Then she did. The cold of the spot she had touched lasted longer than it should have. On the second night, they camped in a cave that had been somebody's home a long time ago. There was a circle of stones for a fire and a niche in the wall where someone had piled bones from a winter that had killed them, or almost killed them, or set them on a road away from this place forever. He could not tell which. He started a fire in the old ring because the old ring had held fires before and stones remember. She fell asleep again before he did. He let her. He sat with the small flame and he watched it, and after a long time, with no one in the world to hear him, he said the name out loud. Halric. Just the name. Nothing else. He had not been able to do that all those months ago at the funeral. He had not been able to do it sitting beside the grave alone 2 weeks after. He had been a king. He had wept like a king. Which is to say, behind his teeth and into his own collar. In the cave he said the name once, and it sounded the way a word sounds when it has been waiting in a man's mouth for a long time to be put down somewhere safe. He did not say it again. On the 3rd morning the drone came. He didn't know what it was when he saw it. He had seen falcons. He had seen ravens. He had seen the hand-trained hawks that the southern lords like to take to court, because a bird on a glove makes a poor man look rich. This was not that. This was a small black shape that moved against the sky in a way nothing alive moves. Straight lines, pivots without wings, a hum that didn't belong to any throat. He pulled her down under a stand of dwarf cedar and held still until it passed. What was that, Drogans? She said it immediately, without surprise. He has more. What is it? A scout, a small one. It sees in the dark, by heat, by the warmth of bodies. There's a screen somewhere a man watches. There's no man on it. It flew alone. A man is on it. He just isn't in the sky. He absorbed this. He did not like it. He had spent 30 years learning every kind of fight a man could be in, and now there was a kind of fight he had not been taught, and the people who knew how to teach it were south, and they did not work for kings. They worked for trade syndicates and free companies and a coalition of merchants out of the Gulf ports who had been buying influence in Stormhold for a generation and a half without ever buying enough of it to matter. Until, apparently now, how long? How long what? How long has he been buying from them? She was quiet for a long time. The hum of the drone faded over the next ridge. There was a caravan. 3 months ago, they came in through the eastern gate. They said they were spice traders. They didn't speak our way. They had crates that were too heavy for spice. Sigrid met them. She didn't meet them in the audience hall. She met them in the lower courtyard. After dark, how do you know? I was bringing wine to the steward. He was supposed to bring it to her. He had drunk half of it already. I took it the rest of the way. Who unpacked the crates, Drogon? Personally, and what was in them, I only saw one. He didn't know I was there. There was a black thing inside. Shaped like a fish, with wings. There were more crates. They went under guard into the old armory. He's stockpiling. He sat in the dirt under the dwarf cedars and stared at the white sky over the trees. and a thing turned in his chest that was bigger than the thing his wife had done to him. The thing his wife had done to him was domestic. It was a knife in his own bed and a hand on his own glass, and it was old as the human race. He could survive it. He had been surviving it since the second he heard her laugh in the tower. This was different. This was a man he had raised opening the eastern gate to people who did not belong inside the walls. This was crates of foreign machinery being walked into his armory in the dark. This was, if he followed it to the place it was going, not a coup. This was a sale. Drogon wasn't taking the throne to sit on it. Drogon was taking the throne to spend it. He's not just betraying you. No, he's betraying the country. Yes, my king, don't, Ragnar. He looked at her. I should have told you sooner. You're telling me now. I wasn't sure. You're sure now. Yes, he nodded once. Then we walk faster. They walked faster. They walked through the rest of that day without stopping for food. They walked through a snowfall that came in at the ribs and stayed there. He thought about a great many things while he walked. He thought about the men he had appointed over the years to watch the Eastern Gate, and how many of them had been quietly replaced in the last 18 months by men whose families he could not have named. He thought about the lower town, and how many children he'd seen in the streets last summer compared to the summer before. He thought about a particular merchant from the Gulf who had come to court 3 years ago and asked for traits and been turned away, and who had not, as far as the court records showed, ever come back. The records would show whatever Drogon wanted them to show. The man had been back. He had been coming back for 3 years. He walked and the snow came down and he understood, in a slow flat way, that the betrayal of his bed was the small one. The betrayal of his bed was a knife between two people. The betrayal under his armory was a knife in the throat of every village south of the Divide that would wake up one morning, in a year or in 5, and find a foreign garrison built on the harbor and attacks in a language they could not read. Bryn walked beside him. She did not try to fill the silence. He was grateful for it. There was nothing she could say that would help, and she was old enough already, at 24, to know that there were silences a man needed to walk through and not around. When they stopped that night, in another hollow under another fallen tree, he did not sleep. He sat with the sword across his knees and he watched the sky for the small black shape with the hum that did not belong to a throat. It did not come back. The clouds came in low. The drone, wherever its man was, could not see them through cloud. He learned, that night, the first useful thing he would ever learn about the new kind of fight. Weather still belonged to the old gods. They were caught at the border because they let themselves be caught. There was no quiet way into Shadowpact territory. The Greymoors had been ambushed too many times for there to be a quiet way. There were 3 passes, and all 3 were watched, and the watchers were the kind of men who killed first and looked at the body afterward to see if killing had been the right call. Ragnar made his decision an hour before the marker stones, and Bryn did not argue with it. We don't run, we don't fight. We let them take us, they'll bind us. Yes, they might hurt us, they might, and if they take the medallion, then we lose it. Don't show it to anyone. Not until I say. She nodded. The wolves came out of the trees the way wolves do when they have been there a while. They didn't hurry, they didn't growl, they surrounded. There were 6. The largest shifted into a man without ceremony, the way old soldiers shift, like changing a coat. He was scarred from cheek to collarbone, and he had a hunting knife at his belt that looked like it had been someone's heirloom before it had been his. You are on Shadowpact ground, flat, bored. The voice of a man who has had to say a sentence too many times. State your business or be torn apart. I am Ragnar Wintermane, Alpha King of the Stormhold Pack. I claim sanctuary under old law. The scarred man stared at him. Then he started to laugh. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has heard a lot of bad jokes in his line of work and is now hearing the worst one. The other warriors did not laugh. They watched their leader laugh and they kept their weapons on Ragnar's throat. Wintermane is dead. Word reached us 4 days ago. Fell in the north. Took an axe in the back. Very tragic. Many tears in many halls. The word you got was a lie. The word we got came with an official seal. The seal is on the desk of a man who paid for it. The scarred man stopped laughing. He stepped closer. Close enough Ragnar could smell the leather oil on his armor. You look like a man who hasn't slept in a week. I haven't. You look like a man who hasn't eaten in 3 days. I haven't. You look like the kind of fool who would walk into Shadowpact land with no army. I am exactly that kind of fool. A long beat, and the girl? Mine, Ragnar said. It came out without thought. He didn't take it back. The scarred man's eyes moved to Bryn for the first time. He looked at her the way a hunter looks at a small thing he isn't sure is worth shooting at. Then he looked back at Ragnar. Bind them. They bound their wrists with leather. They left Bryn's loose enough to keep blood in her hands, which was a kindness Ragnar made a private note of. They tied his tight. They took his sword. He let them. They didn't search his coat. He thanked in the back of his mind. Whatever small god still owed him a favor. They walked. The fortress of the Shadow Pack rose from the side of the mountain, like something a much older country had built and then forgotten to take down. The stones were darker than Stormhold stones. The towers were thicker. The arrow slits in the walls were not arrow slits. They were narrower. They had been recut somewhere in the last 50 years, for the longer bows the Greymoors had started training their children on after the Broken Ridge campaign. After the campaign Ragnar had won, after the campaign that had ended with him standing over Theron Greymoor with a sword at the man's throat and choosing, against every reasonable counsel, not to use it, he had been 35. He had told himself, at the time, that mercy was the smart play. He thought now, walking up the icy switchback toward the gates of a fortress that had spent 20 years preparing to outlive him, that he had been a man too young to know the difference between mercy and a bill he was leaving for his older self to pay. They were marched through a courtyard full of men training. Real training. Not parade ground. The kind where the wooden swords had taken chunks out of the cobblestones, and the instructors didn't yell because they didn't need to. The men watched him pass. None of them said a word. He heard behind him, one of them spit on the stones. He did not turn. The hall was dark and long and smelled of wood smoke and old fat. A fire pit ran down the center. Pelts on the walls, weapons on the pelts, trophies. He counted, without meaning to, 3 blades that had been carried by men he had personally killed. The Greymoors had kept them. At the far end, on a chair carved out of a single piece of blackwood, sat Theron Greymoor. He was older. They were both older. His hair was more silver than the black Ragnar remembered, and the lines around his mouth were the lines of a man who had spent 20 years not smiling. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, the posture of a man who has learned that thrones are uncomfortable and has decided not to pretend. He didn't speak when they came in. He let the silence do work. Then finally, so the dead king walks. The dead king walks. Either you have come to give me a gift, or you have come to give me a corpse. I do not yet know which. I have come to ask for sanctuary. From whom? From my general, and my wife. A flicker then, on Theron's face. He turned his head slightly toward one of the older men standing along the wall. The man nodded once. Ragnar understood. Word reached here too. Word reached everywhere. The official story was already written. He was a dead king, and Drogon was a grieving general, and Sigrid was a tragic widow, and the other packs were sliding their pieces on the board to fit. The maid. She is yours. She is her own. That is a strange answer. It is the true one. Theron's eyes moved briefly to her. Speak, girl. Bryn lifted her chin. He had begun over 3 days of walking, to see the shape of who she was under the grey dress and the scared posture, and what he saw now was a person who had stopped being afraid in any way Theron could use. My name is Bryn Ashthorn. My father was Garin Ashthorn. I am here because someone in Stormhold Keep would have killed me tomorrow morning, if my king had not come home tonight. I am here because that someone wants more than my king's throne. He wants the country. He has been buying weapons from foreigners and walking them into the armory in crates. I have seen the crates. I have seen one of the weapons. It flew over us yesterday at dusk. A new silence in the room, a different silence. Theron sat forward a little. Garin Ashthorn. I knew your father, I know. He was a good man. He was. He died because his prince was a fool. Yes, are you a fool, girl? No. Theron looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Ragnar. Show me your right arm. Ragnar didn't move. Your right arm. Sleeve up. The guard beside Ragnar lifted his sword half an inch. Ragnar held the guard's eyes and then, with the kind of calm a man earns by being out of better options, he turned slightly and pushed back the sleeve of his coat. The scar ran from the bone of his wrist to the inside of his elbow. It was old. It was clean. It had been stitched in the field by a man with a bone needle and no light. Theron looked at it, then he stood up. He came down off his chair and he crossed the hall and he stopped in front of Ragnar and he looked at the scar the way a man looks at a thing he has been thinking about, off and on for 20 years. Broken Ridge, I was kneeling. You were. You had me. I did. Why? It was not the question of a man asking for forgiveness. It was the question of a man who had been carrying a stone in his pocket for 2 decades and was finally putting it on the table. Ragnar took his time. The hall was very quiet. I had 2 reasons. The first was practical. Killing you at Broken Ridge would have meant killing every Greymore your sons would father, because your people would not have stopped fighting until the last of you was in the ground. I would have spent the rest of my reign in a war I had already won. I did not have the stomach, and the second reason, you were kneeling, a pause, that is not a reason, it is. Ragnar's voice was very even. The men I have killed because they were trying to kill me. You stopped trying. I do not put a sword through a man who has stopped trying. I do not care what country he is from. I do not care what blood he is. That was the rule my father gave me. It is one of the few rules of his I have kept. The hall stayed quiet. Then Theron Greymore did something Ragnar had not been prepared for in any of the scenarios he had run during 3 days of walking east through a winter that wanted them dead. He stepped forward and he put both his hands on Ragnar's shoulders, and he leaned in until their foreheads were almost touching. I have owed you 20 years. I will not enjoy paying you. But I will pay you. He stepped back. He turned to the guard, cut them loose. The leather came off. Ragnar rolled his wrists. He felt the blood come back. He felt the medallion still safe inside his coat. He looked at Bryn. She was watching Theron with a face that did not show what she was thinking. But he had been watching her face for 3 days now and he could read it. She was filing the man. She was filing the room. She was filing the angles of the doorways, and where the older man with the bow stood and how many candles burned where. She was already working. You will eat, you will sleep, and then we will talk. Because I am not yet convinced that taking your side is not the most expensive mistake I will ever make. Then let me give you a reason now. Theron raised an eyebrow. In 4 days, a wagon train of 20 guards and 3 carts will move up the pass road toward this fortress. The wagons will be carrying silver. Silver-tipped arrows, silver-edged blades, silver shot. They are not meant for me, they are meant for you. Drogon has been arming for an attack on Shadowpack for at least 3 months. He plans to come north as soon as he has cemented his hold on Stormhold. He plans, in particular, to kill you. The hall did not move. Theron looked at him for a long beat. How do you know this? She knows. She heard them say it. Theron's eyes shifted to Bryn, where the Winter Garden. 3 weeks ago. Drogon was telling Sigrid he had moved up the timeline. He said the silver would arrive by the end of the month. He said by spring the Shadowpack would not have a north border. Sigrid laughed. She said you had a son. A muscle moved along Theron's jaw. Send your scouts, watch the pass road. The wagons will stop at Miller's Creek to water the horses around midday on the 4th day. That is when they will be most vulnerable. The drivers dismount, the guards stretch. There is a stand of pine on the south side of the creek. From inside it, a man can see the road for 200 yards. The older man with the bow, the one standing along the wall, said, very quietly, Miller's Creek is on the map. Theron didn't answer him. He looked at Bryn one more time. Your father would have liked you. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. They were given a tower room, east wall, 2 beds, a small hearth that someone had already lit, a window the width of a man's hand, 2 guards at the door polite and unhappy about it. Food was brought, bread, cheese, a bowl of something hot with meat in it. He ate. She ate. Neither of them spoke for a while. It was the first warm room he had been inside in 5 days. It almost hurt. He'll send scouts. He has already sent them. If we're wrong, we are not wrong. She nodded. She put down her spoon. She didn't pick it back up. What? Nothing. Bryn. She looked at the fire. I never thought I would sit in this fortress. I never thought I would sit in any fortress. I thought I would die in a kitchen somewhere. I thought I would die before I was 30. I did not think I would die in any way that mattered. He watched her. It is strange to be in a place where what I know is worth something. I have spent 12 years learning to be worth nothing. I am not sure how to put it down. He did not know what to say to that. He said after a moment, don't put it down all at once. It is a useful skill, being underestimated. Don't lose it. Just stop applying it to yourself. She thought about that. Then she gave him, for the first time in 3 days, a small movement at the corner of her mouth that he understood was the closest thing she had to a smile. He looked at the fire after that, and he did not look at her again for a long time, because if he looked at her again, he was going to say something he had no right to say to a girl who had saved his life out of a debt owed to a cousin he could not remember the face of. He slept 4 hours. He had not slept 4 hours in a row since the campaign. His body did not know what to do with the rest. He woke before dawn and he sat with his back to the wall and he watched the small window go from black to gray to the color of the inside of a shell. And he thought about all the people in his country who would wake up in the next 4 days, without knowing that a man they had never heard of had been sent to die in a stand of pine by Miller's Creek to save them from a war they did not yet know was coming. That was the work of a king. He had forgotten, somewhere in 30 years of doing it, what the work was for. The scouts came back on the 4th day. They brought a man with them. He was tied across a saddle. He was alive, but he wasn't going to be alive for very long, because the wound across his shoulder had been bleeding into a wool cloak the whole ride back, and the healer who looked at him on the courtyard stones shook her head before she even crouched. They cut him free. They laid him on the cobbles. He was wearing Stormhold colors. He was wearing them. He hadn't been born to them. Ragnar saw it in the man's face the second the helmet came off. The cheekbones were wrong. The hair was wrong. The chin had been shaved in a way no man of the northern packs shaved a chin. He was from somewhere across a sea. He had been put in Stormhold livery and ridden up a mountain pass guarding 3 wagons of silver weapons, and he had died for it because he had been in the wrong stand of pines at the wrong hour of the wrong day. Theron stood beside Ragnar over the body. The girl was right, yes. The wagons are in my courtyard. Show me. He showed him. They had been pulled inside the second curtain wall. The canvas had been thrown back. The crates had been pried. Inside the first crate, on a bed of straw, were arrows. They were beautiful. That was the word a man's mouth wanted to use before his mind caught up. The shafts were the kind of straight black wood that took a craftsman a winter to make. The heads were silver. Bright, not silvered, silver. Heavy enough that a single arrow cost more than a yearling steer. Silver in this country was for killing alphas. That was the only thing silver of that purity was for. There were 3 crates of arrows. There were 2 crates of blades. There were 4 smaller boxes of shot for the new kind of crossbow Drogon had been quietly distributing to the household guard for the last 6 months. There were, at the bottom of the last cart, 3 more of the black things Bryn had warned him about, folded, asleep. Waiting for a hand to wake them up, he stood looking at all of it. He thought about Halric. He thought about how Halric would have looked at this. He thought about how Halric would have said, very quietly, "Well, brother, we have been outflanked by our own boy." He thought about how Halric would not have said it in despair. He would have said it the way old soldiers say bad news, which is to say, with the tone of men deciding what to do next. This was not bought with Stormhold gold. No, he is selling something to pay for this. He is selling everything. Theron looked at him sideways. Coastal access, probably. Mining rights in the upper passes, almost certainly. Maybe people. That one Ragnar didn't answer right away. He looked at the silver in the crates, and he thought about the eastern gate of his keep, and the kinds of crates that had been walking in and out of it. He thought, again, that there had been very few children in the lower town this past summer. He had noticed at the time. He had told himself it was the cold. He had been telling himself a lot of things. Maybe people. Theron took that in. This is no longer a private matter. No, this is no longer about your throne. No, this is about my country too. Yes, and every country east of the divide that he will sell next to keep paying his bills. Yes, Theron breathed out through his nose. He turned and looked across the courtyard at the men he had spent 20 years training to fight other men just like him. And Ragnar could see the moment it happened. The moment a man with a grudge older than some of his soldiers decided to set it down. Not forgive it, not forget it, just set it down. For now, because there was something heavier on the table. Stormhold and Shadowpack have not stood on the same side of a fight since the year my grandfather was born. No, we will not be friends. No, we will be allies until this is done. And then we will go back to being what we were. Agreed, swear it. Ragnar swore it. He did not swear it in any of the formal ways. He said simply, with his hand flat on the side of one of the silver crates, "Until Drogon is in the ground, the north border of Shadowpack is mine to keep as if it were Stormhold's, and the south border of Stormhold is yours to ride into without challenge." Theron put his hand on the other side of the crate. Done. They didn't shake. 20 years was too much for shaking. The attack came 2 nights later. It came without warning, because Drogon had not waited for the silver. He had moved the moment one of his patrols failed to come home. He had pieced the rest together fast, because Ragnar had trained him to piece things together fast, and he had brought every man he could spare and several he could not. 70, maybe more. Heavy armor, siege ladders. 2 of the black flying things in the sky an hour before the rest of them came over the ridge. They hit the eastern wall at the hour the moon went behind the mountain. Ragnar was already on the wall when they came. He had not been able to sleep. He had not been able to eat. He had been sitting on the parapet with his sword across his knees and his eyes on the dark, and when the first drone came over the ridge with its small green light, he understood it was tonight, and he didn't bother to call the alarm because the watch had already seen it, and the bells were going. Bryn was in the east tower with the archers. He had not asked her to do that, she had asked. The old man with the bow had given her a longbow and a quiver and a place at the second window. She had not argued about the bow, she had not pretended. She had drawn it twice in the courtyard the morning before to test the pull, and the old man had watched her draw it, and had walked away without saying anything, because there was nothing to say. Her father had taught her, a man can take a lot of things from his daughter. He cannot take what he has put in her hands. The first wave came up the ladders. The Greymores poured oil. The oil went down the ladders, and the oil went into the snow at the foot of the wall, and the oil caught from the torches, and the night turned orange. Ragnar fought on the wall beside Theron, and a man came at him with a stormhold blade, and the man's face under the helmet was the face of a young soldier Ragnar had promoted himself 2 summers ago, and the young soldier swung first and Ragnar finished it in 3, and did not look at the body when he stepped over it, because if he looked he would not get up again. Your king lives, he shouted it on the wall into the dark. Drogon has lied to you. Look at me, your king lives. Some of them froze, most of them didn't. The ones who didn't were Drogons all the way through. The ones who froze were boys. He killed 3 more and his shoulder went out again in the 3rd one, and he had to put his sword in his offhand for the next stretch, and he did. Because 30 years of fighting teaches a body more than one way to do a job. He saw in the second wave what he had been afraid he would see. The men coming up the second batch of ladders were not Stormhold men. Their armor was not Stormhold armor. Their helmets were a shape he had never seen on a head in his country. They were the men from the wagons. The men from across the sea. The men in his colors had been the bait. The real soldiers were the second wave. The wall had emptied its arrows on the first wave because the first wave had been wearing his crest. The second wave came up cleaner. He understood then how Drogon had been planning to take Shadowpack. He had been planning to throw Ragnar's own boys at the wall first and let the wall waste itself on them. He shouted it down the wall. Hold the arrows. Wait for the second wave. The Greymores held. The next volley went into the foreign helmets, and the foreign helmets went off the ladders, and the bottom of the wall began to look like the floor of a slaughterhouse, and the smell came up. In the east tower, a man in the colors of one of Drogon's lieutenants broke through the line on the second wall and made for Theron's back. Theron didn't see him. Theron was fighting 2 men in front of him. The lieutenant had a clear run, 12 yards, open. Bryn put an arrow through his throat at 280. Ragnar saw it happen. He saw the man drop. He saw across the courtyard and through the smoke and the flying ash, the dark window of the east tower, and the small pale shape standing at it, already knocking the next arrow. Theron, who hadn't seen the man, didn't see the arrow either. He saw the body. He turned. He looked up at the tower. He found Ragnar's eyes across the smoke. He nodded once, the way a man nods to another man who has just paid a debt the second man didn't know was owed. Ragnar shook his head. Not me, the sheikh said. Theron looked at the tower. He bowed his head. A king of the Shadowpack bowed his head, in the middle of a battle, on his own wall, to an Omega in a borrowed tower with a borrowed bow. Ragnar would remember that. He would remember it for the rest of his life. The attack broke at the 2nd hour. Drogon's men pulled back. They left their dead. They left 2 of the black flying things, both shot down out of the sky by an archer on the north tower who had taken the time, in the calm before the wave, to listen carefully to the sound of the things and aim by ear when they passed through cloud. The wall held barely. Theron came down off the parapet, bleeding from a cut over the eye. He found Ragnar in the courtyard with his sword still in his offhand. He put his good hand on Ragnar's neck and pressed his forehead to Ragnar's forehead, and he said, very low, only for him, brother. We ride at first light. Ragnar didn't move. He couldn't for a second. Brother, 20 years. He didn't trust his voice. He nodded. Theron let him go. He turned. He started giving orders. The bells stopped. The wounded were carried in. The dead were laid out. A scout came running up from the south gate with a message that Drogon's main force had withdrawn 10 miles down the road to regroup, and that a rider had been sent ahead of them on a fast horse south. Drogon had not pulled back to fight again here. He had pulled back to get home in time for the memorial. The memorial was in 3 days. 3 days to reach a fortress, 8 days away, with a wounded force and a girl with a longbow and an enemy who would be standing in front of every alpha lord in the country pretending to bury him. Ragnar stood in the courtyard of the Shadow Pack, with a sword in his offhand, and his good shoulder wrenched, and the body of a young Zulja he had once promoted at his feet, and he said, to no one in particular, the words a king says when there is no other move left to make, 20 riders. Mountain Pass. We leave in an hour. Theron, across the courtyard, didn't argue. He just nodded and turned and began picking the riders. They rode out at the hour the wounded were still being counted. 20 riders. Theron at the head with his eye stitched, and his shield strapped because his arm wouldn't lift it without help. Ragnar at his right, with his sword in a sling across his back, because his shoulder was finished for the next month Marthins. Bryn at his left, on a smaller horse with a quiver across the saddle and the longbow strapped along the flank. The pass road was for fools. They took it anyway. The straight road would have put them in the lower country in 5 days. Drogon would beat them by 2. The pass road, if it didn't kill them, would put them at the gates of Stormhold Keep on the 3rd evening. The memorial was on the 3rd evening. They had to be there before the last bell. Theron had picked the riders, not the loudest, not the largest, the quiet ones, the ones who had families and rode anyway, the ones who understood, without being told, that this was not a war ride. This was a hinge of history. If they failed at it, every Alpha Lord east of the Divide would be sitting on the wrong side of the table by the end of the month, and the men selling drones across the sea would have a foothold the entire continent would spend a generation trying to claw back. Ragnar didn't tell them this in those words. He didn't have to. They had seen the silver in the crates. Silver tells its own story. They climbed. The pass narrowed at 3,000 feet. The horses went single file. The wind came down off the high snowfields with a sound like a thing being torn. Bryn rode in front of Ragnar because she had memorized this road off a chart in the Stormhold archive when she was supposed to be dusting it. She had been dusting it. She had been doing both. The map of the High Pass had been folded inside a treatise on grain rotation. She had unfolded it once and folded it back the way she found it. She had not needed it again. He watched her in front of him in the snow, small in the borrowed coat, sitting the horse the way her father had taught her when she was 8, and he thought, not for the first time on this ride, about how many things a man misses when he is busy being a king. There's a cornice ahead, she called it back, voice flat to keep the wind out of it. Single file, don't talk. The snow above us holds because it wants to, until it doesn't. They went under the cornice in silence. The shadow of the overhanging snow ran across them like a hand. He did not breathe until they were past it. He noticed then that none of the riders behind him had breathed either. At the second night, they camped without fire. There was no fire because fire on the High Pass at night is a flag that says, here we are. They ate cold meat. They drank water from skins they had carried inside their coats so it wouldn't freeze. Theron sat with his back against a rock and looked at the stars, and after a long time he said, low enough that only Ragnar and Bryn could hear, if we die up here, my second cousin will sit in my chair, and he is the stupidest man I have ever loved. We won't die up here. No, we won't. That is for later. A beat. Drink your water. Ragnar drank his water. He looked at Bryn across the cold camp. She was wrapped in a wool blanket that one of Theron's riders had given her without being asked. Her hood was up. He could see the line of her jaw and nothing else. She had not slept since the wall. He had not seen her sleep since the wall. You should rest. So should you. I will, then I will. She did not rest. He did not rest. They sat at opposite ends of the camp and they kept watch over each other and neither of them admitted it. Theron noticed. Theron was old enough to notice. Theron said nothing. Because Theron had been married once, a long time ago, before the wife had died in a winter that took half his pack with her, and Theron remembered what it had looked like, very early on, before he had known what it was. On the 3rd morning the wind shifted. Ragnar felt it before he saw it. He had been a king of the northern packs for 30 years, and his body knew weather the way a fisherman's body knows a tide. He looked at Theron. Theron looked at him. 6 hours. Then we have 5. We have 4. They rode harder. The pass dropped down out of the snow at mid-afternoon. The trees came back. The horses, who had been climbing on Hart for 2 days, took the descent with the kind of stubborn grace horses have when they have understood what is being asked of them. Bryn's mare went down a steep cut on her haunches and didn't fall. Ragnar made a private note to find that horse a warm stable for the rest of her natural life. If any of them lived through the next 12 hours, they came out of the foothills with the sun behind them, Stormhold Keep was on the horizon. He had not seen it from this angle in 20 years. He had ridden out of it 10,000 times by the eastern road. He had never come at it from the high pass. From here the keep looked smaller, not because it sat under a sky bigger than it. He saw the black banners on the towers from a mile out. He saw the smoke from the great hall, where the memorial fires would already be lit. He saw a column of riders moving along the southern road below him, and he understood with a small cold satisfaction that the column was Drogon's. Drogon was not yet inside the gate. Drogon was an hour out. They had beaten him by an hour. We don't go to the gate, no, the servants' tunnel? Yes, there will be men in it. There will. How many? 2, if he is being careful. 6, if he is being smart. He has not been smart in 3 weeks. He has been angry. 2 then. They left the horses with 3 of Theron's men in a stand of pines a quarter mile from the eastern wall. They went on foot. 20 became 17. They moved in 2 files. Bryn led. Ragnar walked behind her. Theron walked behind him, with his stitched eye and his good arm and the kind of focus a man brings to the second-to-last fight of his life. The servants' door was unguarded. That was the first thing that was wrong. Bryn stopped them 10 feet short, with one hand. She listened. She held up 1 finger, then 2. Then she shook her head. It's a trap. Yes, he expects us to come this way. He hopes we'll come this way. What do? We go in the other way. There is no other way. There is one. It was never meant for people. She led them around the wall to the north side of the keep. The drainage chute came out of the foundation low to the ground, almost hidden by an old buttress. It was a hole barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. It had not been opened in 80 years. The iron grill across it had rusted to a thing that could be pulled apart by a child if the child was patient. Bryn pulled it apart. She did not look proud of it. She looked tired. They crawled, one at a time, through a tunnel that smelled of every century the keep had been standing. Ragnar went in 5th because Theron insisted. He came up inside the keep in the small storeroom behind the lower scullery, the one that had been bricked off in his grandfather's time and that he had not known still existed. Bryn was already on her feet, brushing dust off her sleeves. Theron came up next. Then the rest, 17 men, stood inside the walls of Stormhold Keep. The keep did not know they were there. Above them, faint through the stone, the bell for the memorial began to ring. Move. They moved. Bryn led them up the back stairs. Not the servants' stair where the trap was. A different one. The one behind the chapel. She had cleaned it on her 2nd day. She had not been told to. She had wanted to know where it went. It went up 2 floors and came out behind a tapestry in the gallery, above the great hall. She had been waiting 4 months for a reason to walk it. This was the reason. They climbed in silence. They passed a sleeping guard on the 2nd landing. Theron's men took him without a sound and tied him and left him breathing, because Theron had been very specific that there would be no killing in the corridors. Killing in the corridors meant alarm. Alarm meant the gates closing. The gates closing meant Drogon arriving in an hour to a city locked in his favor. They reached the tapestry. Bryn put her hand against it. She listened. She nodded. She drew the bow off her back. Ragnar drew his sword in his offhand. Theron drew nothing because Theron's arm was finished. But he had a knife at his belt and an expression that said the knife would be enough. On 3, 1, 2, the tapestry came down. The gallery ran the length of the great hall, 10 feet above the floor, set with carved railings and tall, narrow windows that the dying sun was coming through in red bars. The hall below was full. Every Alpha Lord within 4 days' ride. Every minor pack leader who had ever sworn to Stormhold. The lower lords in dark mourning. The higher lords in formal black with the silver chains of their offices. At the center, on the long stone bier that had held Ragnar's father's body 40 years ago, lay a closed coffin, symbolic, empty. Draped in the Stormhold flag, beside the coffin stood Sigrid in black silk. Beside Sigrid stood Drogon in formal armor. Drogon was not an hour out. Drogon was already there. Ragnar's mind tripped on it for half a second. Then it caught. Drogon had not been on the southern road. The column on the road had been a decoy. Drogon had ridden hard and quiet and gone in through his own gate 2 hours before the bell. He had cleaned himself up. He had put on his ceremonial armor. He was already at the bier with his hand on the flag in the middle of a sentence. And in the long shadow our king's passing leaves over this hall, I make to all of you this pledge. I will not let his work end. I will not let his country drift. I will stand as protector of his widow, and through her of his line, until such time as the council deems it wise to formalize a new order. A murmur ran through the lower lords. The higher lords did not murmur. The higher lords had already known the speech. Brynn knocked the arrow. She did not aim at Drogon. She did not aim at Sigrid. She aimed at the heavy iron candlestand behind the bier, the one with 12 burning candles, the one that had been Ragnar's mother's wedding gift to his father. She drew. She waited. Ragnar stepped up to the railing. He did not shout. He used the voice he used to use when he was tired, and a man at his table needed reminding which side of it he sat on. Drogon, look at me. Drogon's hand froze on the flag. The hall didn't move. Not yet. The lords below did not yet understand what they had heard. They had heard a voice in the rafters. They had heard a voice they almost recognized but couldn't place because the man it belonged to was supposed to be in a snowdrift in the north. Drogon looked up. His face went the color of paper. Sigrid looked up half a second later. Her face did the same thing but slower, because she had to fight the part of herself that had been smiling under the veil. Brynn loosed the arrow. It hit the candlestand at the joint. The candlestand fell. 12 burning candles rolled across the stone floor of the great hall toward the feet of every alpha lord in the country, and the hall finally moved. There were shouts. There were chairs going over. There were swords coming halfway out of scabbards before their lords remembered that drawing steel at a memorial was a thing that could not be taken back. The candles burned out on the cold flagstones. The smell of beeswax rose. The hall, in 3 seconds, became a hall of men standing on their feet, looking up, my lords. The hall went quiet. He came down the gallery stair. Slowly, he did not hurry. He did not rush the entrance. He had been a king for 30 years, and he knew that the first lesson of a hall is that the man who walks slowest is the man who is believed first. He came down with his sword in his offhand, and his coat torn, and his face 2 days unshaved, and he walked along the side of the hall with the lords parting in front of him, because none of them, in that moment, was going to be the man who stood in his way. He stopped 10 feet from the bier. He looked at Drogon. He didn't look at Sigrid. He would. Not yet. You started my funeral without me. That is poor planning. From a man I trained myself to plan. Drogon's hand went to his sword. Don't. The voice came from Theron, behind him, on the gallery. Theron had not come down. Theron was standing at the railing with his knife held loose, and behind him 16 Shadowpack warriors had stepped out of the shadow with their bows half drawn, and the higher lords on the floor had finally understood, all at once, what they were looking at. Drogon's hand fell off his sword. My lords, Ragnar turned a quarter to take in the hall. In the last 7 days I have been hunted across my own country by men wearing my own colors. I have been chased through the high pass by machines bought with the price of our coastline. I have learned that the man standing beside my coffin tonight has been selling Stormhold to a coalition of foreign merchants for the last 18 months, that he has been arming for an unprovoked attack on the Shadowpack to begin before the snow melts, and that he had this maid. He gestured, without turning, and Brynn stepped to the rail above, scheduled to be murdered tomorrow morning in a kitchen fire because she heard him say so in the winter garden 3 weeks ago. He let it sit. If any lord in this hall wishes to call me a liar, do it now. Do it in front of the others. Nobody called him a liar. Drogon very slowly smiled. It was not the smile of a man who had given up. It was the smile of a man who had finally been given permission to set down something he had carried for a long time. He let his hand rest on the edge of the coffin. He let his head tip back a little, the way a man does at the end of a long day. My king, he gave it the irony of full court manners. May I ask one question? Ask, have you ever wondered how your father died? The hall, which had been very quiet, became more quiet than that. Ragnar did not move. He died of the dysentery. The winter I was 15. He died of poison. The winter you were 15? No. Yes? No. My father was the cupbearer of your father's house. My father served your father wine every night for 9 years. My father loved your father. My father would have died for your father, which is, in the end, what he did. Ragnar felt the hall tilt. He didn't move. He didn't show it. But the hall tilted. My father discovered that your father had been quietly killing the line of the Western Pack, not in battle, in their cups, at their tables, to consolidate the North. He did it well. Nobody knew. Nobody but my father who poured the wine. My father said, "My lord, I cannot serve this anymore." My father gave him one chance to stop. Your father that night put a small white powder in my father's own cup. He served it to him with his own hand. He sat with him while he drank it. He held his hand while he died. He told the household it was the dysentery. He buried him at the wall with full honor. He gave me, his orphan son, a place in his guard. He raised me, my king, beside you. He raised me beside you with the blood of my father on his hands, and he never knew that I knew. Ragnar did not move. How did you know? My mother told me, on her deathbed. I was 19. Your father had been dead 4 years. I had already loved you by then, the way a younger brother loves an older brother. I had already sworn an oath to your son. I sat with my mother and she said, "My boy, the king's father killed your father." And I was 19. And I had nowhere to put the knowing, so you put it in 18 months. I put it in 18 years. 18 months is just when I decided to do something with it. The hall did not breathe. Ragnar looked at him. He had thought, walking into this hall, that the worst thing he was going to hear tonight had already been heard. He had thought he had nothing left to be broken by. He had thought he had built the inside room where he was keeping all this, and that the room had a lock. The lock, it turned out, had been on the wrong door. You could have come to me. At any point in 19 years you could have come to me and said what? The truth. And what would the truth have made of you? A man whose father was a murderer. Yes, a man whose father was a murderer. A man whose throne sits on the bones of a cupbearer. A man who would have had to look at me every morning, knowing. You would not have survived it, Ragnar. You would have ground yourself down trying to repay a debt that could not be repaid. And I would have spent my life watching you do it. And neither of us would have lived, so you killed me instead, so I killed you instead, and the country was going to be sold to somebody. If not by me, by your son in 15 years, or by your son's son in 30. The foreign men have been at our gate for 2 generations. Better me, who at least understands the price, than a boy who will be flattered into it for a title. I am not the disease, Ragnar. I am the cure that came too late. You are not a cure. You are a small man with a long grievance, perhaps. But the grievance is not small. No, it is not. A long silence. Ragnar drew a breath. He let it out. The words came out before he had decided to let them. Then we are both our father's sons. And both of us are fools. The hall held it. The lords were looking at him, not at Drogon. At him. They were waiting in the silence for what a king did at a moment like this. He had trained them across 30 years to look at him in that way. He had not until tonight known how heavy the looking was. He thought about killing Drogon there, in front of all of them. He thought about how good it would feel and how clean it would look. He thought about how the lords would lower their heads and how the story would be told for a generation of the king who came back from the dead and put his blade through the traitor in the great hall. He thought about a cupbearer he had never met, dying with the king's hand around his. He did not draw his sword. By ancient law, the crime of betrayal of one's alpha conspiracy in his murder, and the false sale of his country to foreign powers carries 1 sentence. The eldest lords here will confirm. The 3 eldest lords stepped forward, white-bearded, silent they conferred. The eldest, Lord Hagen of the Western Marches, lifted his head. The sentence is death. The method is for the wronged alpha to decide, death by axe, at dawn. According to old law, a small noise from Sigrid. Ragnar still did not look at her. My king. Drogon's voice was barely audible. Take the head yourself. Know why? Because if I take your head with my own hand, I will spend the rest of my life trying not to become my father. And I have decided on the walk from the gallery that I will not give him that. He turned to the eldest lord. Take him. Hold him under guard. At dawn, the sentence is carried out by the headsman, in the courtyard as the law requires. No spectacle, no speeches. Bury him next to his father at the wall, my king. Drogon's voice was lower than before. Thank you, don't. It isn't kindness. It is the only way I know how to bury this without you in my hand for the rest of my life. They took Drogon out. He did not fight them. Ragnar watched him go. He watched the door of his own hall, close behind a man he had raised. He stood very still for a long moment, and then he turned, finally, to his wife. Sigrid had not moved. Sigrid, she did not lift her head. Look at me. She lifted her head. She had been beautiful at 20. She had been beautiful at 30. She was beautiful now, at 51, in the way a winter river is beautiful, hard and bright and not for crossing. He looked at her and he tried to find, anywhere on her face, the woman who had laughed when their son was born. He could not. She had been gone a long time. He had been the last one in the marriage to notice. You let him? I helped him. Why? She looked at him for a long beat. He thought she might lie. He thought she might cry. He thought she might make a small speech. She did none of those things. She said very simply, because I was tired of being his wife. He understood that she meant him. He nodded once, hold her under guard. Not as a prisoner as what she has been. Tomorrow she will be confined to the Western estate and stripped of title. She is not to be in this hall again, my king. Her voice was thin. He didn't answer. She tried again. Ragnar. The name landed on the stone the way a coin lands when nobody picks it up. He did not look at her. He said to the hall, "We have buried no one here tonight. Send the lords home. The memorial is over. Tomorrow we begin the work." The lords bowed. Theron came down off the gallery. Bryn came down behind him. They stood with him at the bier as the lords filed out. None of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The light in the high windows was the last of the day, and then it wasn't. He stood at the bier for a long time after the hall emptied. He put his hand on the empty coffin. He thought about his father. He thought about a man whose name he did not know dying with that hand around his wrist. He thought, "You raised me on a story. The story was wrong. I have spent 40 years honoring a man I did not actually know. What do I do with that?" He did not have an answer. There may not be one. You spend the first 30 years of your life building a picture of the people who made you. You spend the next 30 years using that picture to make decisions. Then, somewhere around 45, you find out the picture was painted by people who needed you to see something specific, and the people themselves were never in the frame. You don't burn the picture. You can't. You painted too much of yourself onto it. You take it down off the wall. You look at the wall. You decide what you are going to put up in its place, if anything. And you understand that whatever you put up will also be wrong, but maybe less wrong, because you know now that wrong is the only kind of picture there is. That was the thought he was thinking when he turned, finally, and walked out of the great hall. And Theron walked beside him, and Bryn walked a step behind, and the three of them went up to the king's tower together, where the candles in the chamber had burned all the way down to the cups. The signing of the peace was done 2 weeks later, in the same upper solar, with 3 witnesses and a scribe, and no flags and no audience, because both kings had decided that public ceremony was the kind of thing that started wars, and that this peace was going to need to live longer than that. The Shadowpack north border was open to Stormhold trade. The Stormhold south border was open to Shadowpack hunters. The first trade caravan crossed the divide a month later and came back without incident, which was the first time in living memory either pack could say that sentence. Theron rode home the day after the signing. At the gate he turned in the saddle. He looked at Ragnar. "If you need me, you know where I am, I know. We won't be friends. No. But if it comes to it, I will ride. So will I." Good, he went. The reorganization of the household took the rest of the winter. The lords who had backed Drogon quietly were not punished. They were observed. Some of them, watching themselves be observed, chose to retire to country estates. Some of them stayed and tried to be useful. A few were quietly relieved of office. The eastern gate was closed to foreign caravans by royal decree. The 2 surviving drones from the silver wagons were studied by a small council of engineers Ragnar had brought up from the lower city, and then on his order, broken apart and the parts buried in different places. He did not want them rebuilt. He did not want anyone in his country to know how to rebuild them. The men who knew how would come from across the sea on their own time, and when they did, he wanted his sons to meet them in the open, not in a courtyard at night. Bryn was given a room in the upper hall. She refused a title at first. She said she did not want a title. She said she had spent her life learning to do useful work without one, and she would like to keep that habit. Ragnar told her she could keep the habit and also have an office, because the office was for everyone else, not for her. She thought about it for a day. Then she agreed. She was named the king's advisor on internal matters. It was a deliberately small title. It carried the largest portfolio any advisor in Stormhold had carried in a generation. She built in the first 3 months a quiet network of omegas and servants in every major household in the country, paid out of the king's own purse, answerable to her alone. They did not spy. They listened. They reported what they heard in the kitchens and in the corridors. They told her, more than once, things that prevented small fires before the smoke. She did not show off about it. She made it boring on purpose. Halric Stormwatch was given a proper service, finally, at the wall. Ragnar wrote what was said. He did not read it aloud. He gave the paper to Bryn afterward, and she folded it, and she said nothing, because nothing was the right thing to say. There was no wedding. There was, one night near the end of that first winter, a conversation on the parapet above the eastern wall. Snow was coming. Ragnar had been standing there an hour. She came up because she had been told he was up there, and because she had begun, in the small private way of people who work closely with someone, to notice when he stood in one place too long. He turned when he heard her step. Halric chose well. She did not answer. She stood with him at the parapet. The snow began. They watched it fall onto the courtyard for a while. After a long time, he said, "I don't want you to marry me out of gratitude. I don't want you to marry me because you were saved by a man who was saved by you. I don't want any of the reasons I would have asked for 20 years ago when I was a young king and I thought reasons were what marriages were made of. No. So I am not going to ask. Good. If you ever decide otherwise, you will know where to find me, I will. And if you don't, then we work together, the way we have been working, until one of us is too old to do it. That sounds like a long time. It might be. The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. In that small private way he had spent 4 months learning to read. It was the first time he had seen it without smoke or blood or a winter river between them, and he understood, watching it, that he had spent 30 years thinking he understood what a partner was, and he had been wrong. A partner was not a person who agreed with you. A partner was a person who stood in your hallway when the house was on fire and put their finger to their lips because they had counted the guards before you came home. He thought about all the men he knew, his own age, who had spent 50 years walking past their wives and their friends and their sons, without ever once asking what was actually in the room with them. He thought about how easy it was, how easy it had been for him, how easy it would be again if he let it, he thought. You do not get to be a king of anything if you do not first learn to be a man who looks. The snow came down on Stormhold Keep, and on the empty bier in the great hall, and on the grave of a cup-bearer at the wall, and on the grave next to it of a general who had carried a story too heavy to put down. The snow did not know whose graves it was falling on. The snow does not know things. It is the people walking through it who have to do the knowing. It is the people walking through it who have to decide what they are going to do with what they know. Now let me ask you something, gentlemen. I know some of you have been hunted in your own houses one way or another, by a partner, by a brother, by a friend you raised. I know some of you have learned, late in life, that the father you loved was not the father you thought you had. I know some of you have spent years standing on a parapet of your own, trying to decide what to do with the picture on the wall. Tell me about it. Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the man you trusted who turned. Tell me about the day you found out who your father really was. Tell me about the quiet person in your house you finally learned to see. I read everyone, and if this story put a hand on your shoulder tonight, send it to the man at your table you'd most want sitting next to you on a wall like that one. Because the truth is none of us get to the end of this road alone, and the older I get the more I think the whole point was learning, finally, who to walk it with.